They didn't fire me because I forgot the boss's birthday. They fired me because they thought the system would keep running without the person who knew why it ever worked in the first place. I remember the heat that morning in Houston. Not the kind you shrug off as summer, but the kind that presses the air down so hard everything feels a step slower. I stayed in the Gridcore parking lot longer than I needed to. My badge was already gone. My bag sat in the passenger seat. My hands rested on the wheel, but I didn't start the engine. The glass building in front of me reflected the sky like it always did. Nothing about it suggested that just minutes earlier I'd been removed from a system I'd spent nearly 20 years keeping from coming apart. My personal phone buzzed before I even had my seatbelt on. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I didn't need to answer either. I glanced at the screen, let it ring twice, then silenced it. There would be another call in 15 minutes, 3 more within the hour. By mid-afternoon, the people who never called directly would start calling, and before the day was over, the ones who only trusted official channels would be looking for my personal number. The system hadn't failed. Not yet. It wouldn't fail right away. That's not how systems like this break. They go quiet first. My name is Rachel Carter. I'm 45. My last title was Director of Operational Continuity, a name that doesn't sound important enough for investor calls, but carries enough weight that the people who actually keep things running know exactly who to call when things start drifting off course. I didn't have a corner office, no headshot on the company website, no one invited me on stage to talk about vision. I wasn't the kind of person LinkedIn likes to highlight. But if you asked any station manager, any supplier who's ever had to decide whether to keep delivering or pull back to protect themselves, they knew who I was. My job wasn't to run the system in the technical sense. I wasn't the engineer in the control room. I wasn't the lawyer signing contracts. I wasn't the one closing budgets. My job was to stand between all of them and make sure that when things got tight, they still trusted each other enough not to let go. I knew who trusted who and who only pretended to. I knew who would pick up at 2 in the morning and who would let it ring and call back during business hours. I knew who feared liability more than losing money and who feared losing money more than their reputation. I knew when a contract that looked solid was actually sitting on a clause that could stop everything with a single shift. I didn't run the system alone. I just knew how to keep the parts that didn't trust each other moving in the same direction. My phone buzzed again. This time I looked. A manager from one of the fuel suppliers, not someone who called directly. I let it ring longer, but I still didn't answer. I reached for the coffee in the console. It had gone cold. I took a sip anyway. The bitterness was familiar enough to keep my head clear. My right shoulder ached, the kind of dull pain you get from sitting the same way for too many years. I rolled my neck, glanced at the rearview mirror, and out of habit checked the weather before I checked my email. The temperature would climb another couple of degrees by the afternoon. That didn't help. I wasn't angry. Not the way people expect when they get fired. I didn't feel the urge to walk back in and tell them exactly how wrong they were. I didn't reach for a lawyer. I didn't start drafting a long, carefully worded email. I just felt cold. Not because of what they did to me, but because I knew exactly what they had just done to themselves. A system like Gridcore doesn't collapse from a single blow. It collapses when enough people start wondering whether they're still protected if they keep doing what they've always done. And that question never shows up in a report. It shows up in small calls, delayed decisions, and slower nods. I looked at the building one more time. Everything still looked normal. The parking lot was full. People were walking in with coffee in hand, talking about things that had nothing to do with the fact that today was the day the system began to change. I set my phone down on the seat and finally started the engine. In 6 hours, they'd think the system was glitching. In 12, they'd realize the problem wasn't the system at all. I merged onto the highway and let the traffic carry me forward more out of habit than intention. The city moved like nothing had changed. Traffic lights kept their rhythm. Buildings stayed lit. Everything about it made you believe the system was stable. Most of the time, things only look stable because nothing has pushed them hard enough to reveal where they're weak. Gridcore was never easy to understand from the outside. People like to think of it as something simple: power plants, fuel contracts, transmission lines. But the longer you stayed, the more you realized it wasn't a machine. It was a network of fragile agreements held together just well enough to keep things moving. Yes, there were plants. Yes, there were transmission routes, long-term contracts, maintenance crews, emergency vendors, and layers of compliance. But none of it truly operated on its own. Every part depended on whether the next part still believed it was safe to keep going. And safe wasn't a number on a dashboard, it was a feeling. Legal needed clarity before they signed anything. Operations needed to move fast before things got worse. Suppliers needed to know they wouldn't be dragged into liability they couldn't control. None of them were wrong. But if each side only did what was technically correct, the system would stall almost immediately. My job was to stand in the middle of that and make sure correct didn't become the reason everything stopped. I didn't give orders. I translated. I told legal what was acceptable in the real world. I told operations what would lock them out if they moved too fast. I told suppliers what they could trust, even when it wasn't fully written into an amendment yet. My name wasn't on those agreements. But the way they were understood, and more importantly, the way they held together when things started slipping, had more to do with me than anything you'd ever see in a report. I remember one night, a few years back, when a storm rolled through the outskirts of Houston. Not the worst storm we'd seen, but enough to expose the kind of weaknesses no one notices on a normal day. A pressure valve at a transfer point started acting up. Not critical yet, but if it drifted further, it could take out the supply to an entire section. If we shut it down, we protected the system technically, but disrupted everything downstream. If we kept it running, the risk increased with time. There was no clean option. Engineering wanted to shut it down. The fuel supplier wanted to keep deliveries moving. Legal hadn't finalized the insurance adjustments for that scenario. 3 sides, 3 valid positions, and none of them willing to be the one left holding the liability if things went wrong. I stood in the control room that night, moving between calls, not speaking for them, but forcing them to hear each other. I reminded them of what they had already agreed to in similar situations. I pointed out where the system would break if one side stepped back, and I made it clear who would stand behind the decision if it went wrong, not in writing, but in a way they knew I wouldn't disappear when it mattered. There was nothing heroic about it, no perfect call, just a series of compromises, good enough to keep things running one more night. The next morning, no one talked about it. The dashboard stayed green. The reports looked clean. And if you hadn't been there, you'd never know how close things had come to stopping. That's the part no presentation ever shows. Gridcor's contracts were tight. The contingency processes were too, but none of it ran on its own. It had to be activated at the right time in the right way by the right person willing to take responsibility. And that part was never in the documentation. Our partners didn't keep working with us because of the terms. They stayed because they knew that if things went sideways, there was someone who wouldn't drop off. The call wouldn't hide behind email and wouldn't leave them exposed alone. That had always been me. Maybe that's why I never thought I'd leave like this. I didn't love the company the way people describe in internal emails. I didn't believe in the whole corporate family story. But I believed that a complex system could stay functional if enough people did their part responsibly, and if someone stood in the middle, making sure they didn't turn on each other when things got difficult. I thought I'd be there until I couldn't do that anymore. My phone buzzed again, longer this time. I glanced at the name, then turned the screen off. Not because I didn't care, but because I already knew the question they were going to ask and the answer they weren't ready to hear. I stopped at an intersection, watching people cross traffic flowing around me, and realized something I'd probably understood for years but never said out loud. I didn't keep the power running. I kept the trust that allowed it to. I drove a few more miles before the phone finally stopped buzzing. Not because things were getting better, but because the people who needed to call directly already had. What came next would shift into internal conversations, longer email threads, and sudden meetings, where people talked more than usual to cover the fact that they didn't actually understand what was happening. That's usually when someone like Ethan Cole steps in. Ethan was 34 when he took over Gridcore, MBA from a school the board liked to mention. Smooth speaker, never stumbled. Knew how to make a plan sound ambitious enough to impress, but safe enough not to scare investors. He wasn't someone you could easily dismiss. If I'm being direct, Ethan wasn't stupid. He cut costs everyone knew were wasteful, but no one had the authority or the nerve to touch. He forced transparency on departments that had been coasting for too long, stripped away reports that looked good but meant nothing. He replaced outdated reporting systems with something cleaner, faster, and on the surface more accurate. Those were all the right moves. That's why the board liked him, and why, at least for the first few months, a lot of people inside the company believed he might be exactly what Gridcore needed. The problem wasn't what Ethan got right. The problem was what he couldn't see. To him, anything that couldn't be standardized, measured, or pushed onto a dashboard was a dangerous dependency, and in his eyes, I represented exactly that. Someone who held too many relationships in her head, someone too many critical decisions flowed through without leaving a clean trace in the system, someone whose absence would leave a gap no process could immediately fill. To Ethan, that wasn't an asset. It was a liability. He wasn't wrong to see the risk. He was wrong to believe he could remove it without exposing everything it had been holding together. We didn't clash right away. The first few months were polite. Ethan asked, I answered. He proposed changes, I pointed out where things might break. Sometimes he listened, sometimes he didn't. There was one meeting I remember clearly. He was presenting a plan to optimize emergency response flows. Everything looked clean, steps reduced, touch points consolidated, response times projected to improve significantly. I asked one question. Who decides when both sides are right, but neither wants to own the risk? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the person standing beside him, Daniel Reeves, the new chief of staff, who was almost always there in the important meetings. Daniel was younger, sharp, in a different way. Fast, precise, always had an answer, always had a slide ready. He was the one who turned Ethan's ideas into something that could be packaged and sold in a boardroom. And he didn't hide the fact that he saw what I did as leftover structure from a system that hadn't been fully cleaned up yet. We'll have a clear escalation path, Daniel said. No more dependency on individuals. It sounded reasonable. In reality, escalation paths don't make people take risks faster. They just make it easier to pass responsibility to someone else. Ethan nodded, continued his presentation, and the meeting moved on. No argument, no visible conflict. Just a difference both sides assumed would resolve itself over time. I didn't think he hated me. I think I made him uncomfortable. Not because I pushed back. I never did that in a way that put him on the spot. I worked. I fixed what I could. I said what needed to be said, then let him decide. But my presence was a constant reminder that parts of this system couldn't be controlled from a conference room. And Ethan didn't want that reminder to stick around. Some pressures don't need to be spoken to be understood. His father was still there, even if not running things day to day. A shadow big enough that every decision Ethan made would be compared whether anyone said it out loud or not. The board wanted results, not in 3 years, in 3 quarters. And Ethan needed to prove he wasn't just in that chair because of his last name. In that environment, someone like me wasn't an easy ally. I was proof that parts of this company didn't start with him and wouldn't disappear just because he wanted them to. I didn't have to say it. My presence already did. My phone buzzed again as I changed lanes. This time I answered. Rachel, we just received a notice. I know I said calm. You should start reviewing any clauses tied to change of authority, and don't confirm anything until you know who's signing off now. There was a pause on the other end. Is this serious? I watched the traffic ahead, then checked the mirror. It's not serious yet, I said, but it won't fix itself. I ended the call before he could ask anything else. Ethan didn't want to learn how the system survived before he got there. He wanted the world to believe it only started working the day he took over. I ended the call, but it wasn't the last one that day. The days that followed didn't have a single moment you could point to and call a collapse. There was no sudden shutdown, no headlines, no one standing up to say something had gone wrong. Just small changes, small enough that no one in a boardroom would call them urgent. Ethan started with things that sounded reasonable. All communication channels were consolidated into a centralized platform. No more off-the-record calls. Everything had to go through the system for transparency. Approval processes were standardized. No more case-by-case decisions. If it didn't fit the flow, it didn't exist. Emergency flexibility was reduced. The gray areas that once allowed people to move fast were replaced with additional checkpoints. A few smaller vendors, people who had worked with us for years, were replaced with more cost-efficient options. On paper, the numbers looked better. In reality, these were people who had never had to decide between 3 in the morning without complete information. The roles of people like me and others who operated the same way in different parts of the system started shrinking. Not eliminated outright, but gradually repositioned as reference points instead of decision makers. None of those decisions was entirely wrong, but each one removed a layer of cushion. I didn't push back publicly. No long emails, no tense meetings. I worked the way I always had, only now every day came with a few more gaps to patch. A contract renewal nearly slipped because the new owner didn't recognize a small clause that needed to be triggered before expiration. I called the other side directly, bought just enough time to get it formalized. A load distribution order got stuck because the new system didn't allow overrides in undefined scenarios. I found someone with temporary authority, explained just enough for them to sign without feeling like they were stepping into uncontrolled risk. A maintenance crew refused to deploy because there was no clear confirmation of liability coverage in case something went wrong. I stepped in, reminded both sides what had already been agreed to, and made sure no one felt like they'd be left holding the consequences alone. One of our longtime partners called me directly, bypassing the new chain entirely. "Your people sound like they're reading from a script," he said. "I don't know when I'm supposed to trust them. I didn't criticize anyone. I just explained enough for him to keep moving one more time. And each time that happened, the system made it through another day without anyone in the boardroom realizing it had moved a little closer to the breaking point. The dashboard stayed green. And when the dashboard stays green, the people making decisions believe they're doing the right thing. That's when I started to understand something I hadn't considered before. I wasn't being used to hold the system together anymore. I was being used to delay the consequences. The difference matters. When you're holding the system together, you're part of the solution. When you're delaying consequences, you're buying time for a problem someone else will eventually need a name to blame. And the cost of that doesn't show up right away. It shows up in the way people start to see you. Linda was the first to say it out loud. We'd worked together long enough to skip the polite version. "HR's watching you," she said quietly, standing with me near a conference room. "They won't say it directly, but they've tagged you as resistant." "I'm not pushing back," I said. "I know," she nodded. "But you're still there when things don't match their plan. And that doesn't help the narrative they're building." I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't understand, but because I understood too well. People who used to come to me first started being more careful. Not because they trusted me less, but because they didn't want to be seen standing too close while things were changing. Some meetings I used to be in were now scheduled later, or not at all, labeled "not necessary at this level." No one said I was being pushed out, but you don't need someone to say it to recognize it. I kept working, kept answering calls, kept fixing what I could. But each time it became clearer that I was holding something other people were slowly letting go of. One afternoon, after watching a small issue resolve cleanly because I stepped in, I paused longer than usual. If I hadn't been there, it wouldn't have been fixed in time, and if it hadn't been fixed in time, it would have turned into something bigger. And when it became something bigger, there would have been a meeting, a report, and eventually a name attached to it. I looked around at everyone working, and I knew none of them actually wanted the system to fail. They just believed it didn't depend on things they couldn't see. I was still the cushion. The difference was, by then I understood. Once they pushed through the last layer, they'd blame the floor for cracking. That week started like any other peak week in Houston, except the temperature didn't drop at night. The system never got a chance to breathe. When the heat doesn't ease, demand doesn't either, and the margins you usually rely on disappear faster than you expect. I had been in the control room since early morning, tracking a chain of confirmations tied to peak supply. Not something you let slip. A few backup fuel contracts needed to be triggered at exactly the right moment too early, and you waste capacity too late and the entire grid starts pushing beyond safe limits. Everything was fragile but under control. The kind of situation where you keep one eye on multiple screens, your phone within reach, and your head already a few steps ahead of what's happening. That's when the email came in. The subject line was simple, the message wasn't. Executive birthday celebration attendance expected. It wasn't just an invitation. It was written in a way that made it clear your presence wasn't optional in spirit. It was part of showing up for the new leadership culture, a signal that you were aligned with where things were going. The timing overlapped exactly with the window I needed to be watching most closely. I read the email twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because I knew the decision wasn't just about showing up or not. I replied briefly, clear, professional. I explained the operational situation and outlined the risks of stepping away at that moment. No criticism, no sarcasm, no personal stance. Just enough that anyone who actually understood the system would recognize it made sense. I hit send and went back to the screens. For the next few hours, nothing came back. No calls, no messages. Everything continued as if it hadn't happened. That didn't reassure me. I'd been in the company long enough to know when a small decision was being saved for a more convenient moment. The next morning, part of my access was blocked. Not everything, just enough to make you pause and wonder if it was a temporary glitch. 5 minutes later, I got the email from HR. Rachel, can you step into conference room B at 10? There was nothing urgent in the wording. No signal that this was anything unusual, just a meeting. I showed up a few minutes early. The room was already occupied. HR on one side. Ethan is across from them. Daniel was standing slightly behind, like always. The atmosphere wasn't tense in the way people imagine. It was controlled, professional, cold enough that no one had to show anything real. HR started. Rachel, we appreciate your contributions over the years. I'd heard enough openings like that to know exactly where it was going. However, we've been observing some ongoing challenges in alignment, lack of alignment, concerns around leadership cohesion. Some resistance to integration with the new operational model, resistance to integration, and overall a mismatch with the executive culture we are building moving forward. Executive culture mismatch. Stacked together, it all sounded reasonable if you didn't know what it was replacing. I didn't interrupt, I let them finish. Then I looked at Ethan. You think this is a culture issue? I asked. He didn't avoid it. I think it's about building a system that doesn't depend on individuals, he said. Calm, certain. We need consistency, scalability. There was no hostility in it, just belief. I understand, I nodded. And you believe that system is ready. We're moving in that direction. Moving, I repeated, like I was testing how the word held up in that context. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence sit just long enough for everyone in the room to feel that this wasn't just another exchange. Then I said it. You're not firing a person, I said evenly. You're stepping into the hottest week of the year without anyone in this room knowing who's going to stop picking up the phone first. No one responded immediately. HR looked down at the paperwork. Daniel didn't move. Ethan just watched me like he was deciding whether that was a warning or just a reaction. I believe we can handle it, he said after a few seconds. I nodded. I hope so. There was no argument, no escalation, just a decision that had already been made, now being executed as cleanly as possible. HR slid a document across the table. Process, terms, effective date. I signed. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't need more time to understand what was happening. When I stood up, no one tried to stop me. No one offered anything personal. Everything stayed just polite enough that no one had to feel worse than necessary. I walked out of the room down a hallway I'd crossed thousands of times and realized my reaction didn't match what people usually describe. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shocked. I was calculating. By the time I walked out of HR, I wasn't angry anymore. I was counting down. I sat in the car a few minutes longer after leaving the building, not because I wasn't ready to go, but because I needed to make sure my next move didn't cross a line I had set for myself a long time ago. I wasn't going to break the system. I wasn't going to touch anything I no longer had access to, and I wasn't going to do anything that could later be called sabotage. But I also wasn't going to pretend that my leaving was insignificant. I opened my laptop connected to my hotspot and logged into my personal email, the one only a handful of people in the system knew about, used only when the official channels weren't fast enough or flexible enough. I drafted a short email. Clean, dry, no emotion. I stated that I was no longer an authorized operator at GridCore, that any approvals previously routed through me needed to be redirected to the company, that certain contracts included continuity review clauses, and that all parties should reassess their risk before proceeding with any active transactions. I didn't tell anyone to stop. I didn't suggest any action. I just placed the information exactly where it needed to be seen. Then I hit send. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. No flood of calls. No visible signs of disruption. From the outside, everything looked normal. And that was the most dangerous part, because early silence always makes people believe things are still under control. About an hour in, the phone started ringing. I answered. A familiar supplier asked directly what this meant. I told him simply that I was no longer the point of contact and that everything needed to be re-verified through the company. He asked what would happen if they kept moving forward as planned. I told him that it depended on his contract, but he should be very clear about who would be carrying the liability if something went wrong. I didn't need to say more. He understood. Another call came in from a vendor's legal team. They asked who had authority now. I told them that was something they needed to confirm directly with GridCore before proceeding. Out in the field, an operations crew called, asking whether my old authorization codes were still valid. I told them no, and not to rely on anything tied to me anymore. Simple answers started creating space. By the third hour, the cautious ones began to move. A fuel supplier held back a pending delivery not to cause problems, but because they couldn't clearly identify who would take responsibility if something went wrong. A maintenance contractor refused to dispatch their crew until they had a clear signature from someone with proper authority. They didn't refuse. They delayed. On the other hand, compliance teams began reviewing clauses tied to change of authority clauses no one pays attention to until they're suddenly the only thing that matters and once open can't be rushed through conversation. None of it was unusual on its own. But systems don't react in isolated pieces. They react in how those pieces stop trusting each other enough to take the next step. By the fifth hour, I got the call I knew would tell me where things really stood. Mike, a station manager with over 20 years in the field, the kind of person who doesn't call unless it matters. He didn't waste time. He asked if they had just fired the only person who knew where the line couldn't be crossed. I didn't answer directly. I asked what he was seeing. He said everything was still running, but no one wanted to be the one to make the next call. I told him that was exactly when he needed to be most careful. He asked if I was coming back. I said no. He just replied that they'd learn fast, then hung up. It wasn't a threat, just an observation. On the other side, Ethan was finally starting to notice the shift. He called me early in the afternoon, still composed, framing it as a transition issue. He said the system was designed not to depend on any single individual. I didn't argue. I just said I hoped so. He didn't push further. Maybe he hadn't seen enough yet. Or maybe he still believed this was temporary noise. By the end of the day, no area had lost power. No major failure had surfaced. Nothing big enough to draw outside attention. If you looked at the dashboard, everything was still within acceptable limits. But if you knew where to look between the numbers, you could see it changing. Decisions were slowing down, calls were taking longer, answers were becoming more careful. No one was saying no, but more and more people were saying wait. By the end of the day, the system hadn't collapsed. It had just stiffened like a body starting to go into shock. The next morning, things moved faster than I expected, but not in the way people were hoping for. There was no immediate collapse, no visible breakdown. Instead, there was a strong, coordinated response that for a short window looked effective enough to convince people everything was under control. Ethan didn't wait. He pulled everything he had into motion. It was brought in to restore access and clear blocked flows. Legal went through contracts to force continuity through hard terms. Consultants were brought in not to understand the system, but to build a replacement structure fast enough to resemble a solution. A new point of control was established almost immediately, not a person, a team, exactly how Ethan believed it should be. No individual dependency. Everything routed through them. Every call, every approval, every decision. Within hours, some flows started moving again. A load dispatch was cleared. A supplier agreed to continue delivery under reinforced contractual terms. A few operational crews returned after getting confirmation from higher up. If you were inside GridCore at that moment, you would have started breathing again. I got a few messages, not directly through people who still kept in touch. They said things looked better, that Ethan seemed to have it under control. Maybe I had been too pessimistic. I didn't respond, I just watched, because I knew something they didn't. When a system is actually recovering, you don't need to convince anyone. It proves itself. The moment people start saying it looks fine, it usually means they haven't looked deep enough. That was a false recovery. Just enough improvement to calm the room, but nowhere near enough to fix the cause. Ethan needed more than that. He needed proof. Not just for the board, but for everyone starting to doubt. And the fastest way to prove it was to make the system run not in parts, but as a whole chain. So a decision was made to restart a major distribution sequence that had been slowed the day before. On paper, everything checked out. Steps marked complete. New control points in place. No visible warnings. But there was one thing no checklist accounted for: the things that hadn't been verified. The sequence went live. At first, nothing happened. Then a load point began to drift. Not dramatically, just a slight imbalance. But in systems like this, small deviations don't stay small. They spread. One area started to destabilize. Secondary lines picked up excess load. A correction was made too quickly based on incomplete data. And then a section went down. Not the entire city, not something that would make headlines right away, just large enough to matter and small enough for someone to still call it contained. Until I saw where it was. A hospital sat inside that zone. I didn't need a call to understand what came next. Backup systems would kick in. Generators would run. But backup isn't a solution. It buys time. And if the distribution chain isn't corrected properly, that time runs out. I sat there, hands still on the wheel, and for the first time since I left the building, I hesitated. I had chosen not to intervene. I had chosen to let the system respond to what had changed. But the people in that hospital weren't part of that decision. They didn't know who Ethan was. They didn't care about GridCore's structure. They just needed power. I picked up the phone. Not to call GridCore. I called someone at another utility, someone who understood enough not to ask unnecessary questions. I need an emergency transfer, I said, not through GridCore. There was a pause. He reminded me I wasn't there anymore. I told him I knew. Then I added one thing. There's a hospital in that zone. That was enough. Backup supply was opened. A line was adjusted. Load was redirected just enough to keep the critical systems running. Not perfect, not fully stable, but enough. I watched the map stabilize and knew I could do more if I wanted. I could make more calls, pull more connections, help them recover more of it. But I didn't. Not because I couldn't, but because I understood that if I kept holding the system up, they would never see what was actually happening. And this time the cost wasn't just the system. It was the people who would keep getting pushed into risk by decisions made without understanding the consequences. I leaned back, closed my eyes for a second, then opened them. From this point on, there would be people who believed I walked away at the worst possible time, that I wasn't there to hold things together, that I let it fall. They wouldn't see the full picture, and maybe they didn't need to. I couldn't control how they understood the story. I could only control what I did inside it. I wasn't going to let a hospital lose power. But I wasn't going to keep holding an empire upright, just so the person running it could learn by stepping over everyone else. I didn't look back at GridCore again that day, not because I wanted a clean break, but because I had seen enough to know what would happen next. When a system starts losing its center, it doesn't collapse right away. It starts looking for a new one. The first call from the other side came that same evening. Not unexpected. Just earlier than I thought. Meridian Power. They had reached out before, more than once over the years. Back then, the offers were straightforward, better title, higher pay, more authority, and every time I turned them down. Not because they weren't good enough, but because I didn't have a reason to leave. This time felt different. There was no formal offer, no job description, no numbers. We think you're in a position where it makes sense for both sides to talk, the voice on the line said. I didn't ask how they knew. In this industry, information doesn't sit still for long. We met the next morning in a conference room with no company logo on the wall. Not because it was secret, but because both sides understood this wasn't an interview. It was a negotiation. They didn't ask if I wanted to join. They asked what I was seeing. I didn't walk them through the details. I just told them enough to understand one thing: the system wasn't collapsing. It was shifting. They understood immediately. What do you want? The man across from me asked. That was the only question that mattered. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to be sure that whatever I said was something I was willing to stand behind long term. I don't need a new title, I said. I need real operational authority. They didn't interrupt. I'm not interested in being the face of a system I don't control. If I'm there, I need decision power when things don't follow the script. A nod. I'm not coming alone, I continued. There are people who need to come with me, not because they're loyal to me, but because they understand how the system actually runs. They took that in. And I'm not joining anything that ignores essential obligations. I don't care how optimized it looks if the people at the end of the chain are the ones absorbing the risk. This time, they took longer to respond. We can work with that, they said finally. The conversation didn't last longer than it needed to. No big promises, no empty assurances, just terms clear enough that both sides understood exactly what they were stepping into. When I walked out of that room, I didn't have a contract in hand, but I knew something more certain than anything written on paper. The center was moving. Within 24 hours, the shift wasn't just in scattered calls anymore. Partners started actively looking for alternatives. Not everyone walked away from GridCore, but many began reducing their exposure. Some contracts weren't canceled, they were adjusted. Some flows weren't stopped, they were scaled back. Those decisions didn't show up in reports, but they changed how the system functioned. By 72 hours, the shift became visible. A few contracts started moving volume elsewhere. Not entirely, but enough to create an imbalance. The people who once depended on GridCore now had options. A week later, GridCore still existed, But it was no longer the center of as many connections as it used to be. The system didn't disappear, it just moved, and not everyone moved with me. Linda called on the third day. "So you're really gone?" she asked. "Yeah." A pause. "I can't," she said after a moment. "Not because I think they're right. I can't leave right now." I understood. Some people stay because they believe the system can still be saved. Some stay because they can't walk away from something they helped build. And some stay because they don't want to stand on the other side of the story. "I don't need you to come with me," I said. "I just need you to know where you're standing." She let out a quiet laugh. "I always do." We ended the call without saying anything more. Not everyone reaches the same stopping point, and not everyone has to. I didn't take data, I didn't take systems. I took the only thing that made those systems work in the first place: relationships, promises that had been kept, and the people who still believed that when I said a system would hold, it would. They didn't call it a collapse. There was no press release saying Gridcore was failing, no headline clean enough to capture what was actually happening. But within a week, anyone close enough to the system knew it wasn't the same entity anymore. The board started meeting constantly. Not scheduled sessions, but emergency ones. Longer, tighter, and with less strategy each time. When a system starts losing control, strategy is the first thing to go. It gets replaced by reaction. The founder came back, not to take over completely, but enough to sit in on the decisions that mattered. The shadow Ethan had been working under wasn't abstract anymore. It was in the room now, watching everything in real time. The market didn't need the full picture to react, it just needed signals. A few contracts quietly adjusted. A few major partners are changing how they engage. Delays are showing up where there hadn't been any before. Piece by piece, external confidence tightened. Partners didn't leave all at once. They did what every system does when it stops feeling safe. They pulled back, asked for more confirmations, added protective clauses, reduced their exposure, and in doing so, pushed the risk back onto Gridcore. Inside the company, things became harder to predict. Conversations that used to take one call now needed 3 meetings. Decisions that once took minutes stretched into hours. Not because people were less capable, but because no one was sure who would stand behind them if they were wrong. Ethan didn't disappear overnight. He stayed in place at first, trying to hold together the structure he had built. But as more issues surfaced, it became harder to ignore the real problem. It wasn't an effort, it wasn't execution. It was that he had misunderstood what he was running. Eventually, his authority was pulled back. Not through one dramatic moment, but through a series of temporary adjustments until there was nothing left to adjust. A CEO doesn't need to be fired to lose control. He just needs enough decisions to stop going through him. I wasn't there when it happened. I didn't need to be. On the other side, I stepped into my new role with a feeling I hadn't expected. Not victory, not relief. Something quieter, heavier, like walking away from something you helped build, knowing it won't ever come back the same. I got to work almost immediately. The new system didn't wait. What I carried had to be placed carefully, right people, right positions, right timing. But even in the middle of that, there were calls I couldn't ignore. Someone from my old operations team called asking about a clause they weren't sure still held. I wasn't there anymore, but I still knew the answer. I didn't help them work around the new system. I just made sure they weren't crushed by something they didn't create. Another call came from HR about a group of workers caught between 2 contracts. I didn't have authority, but I knew who did. I connected them just enough to make sure the people who didn't deserve the fallout could get through it. I didn't go back to save Gridcore, but I didn't turn my back on the people who had no choice in what happened. The last conversation came sooner than I expected. The founder called me directly. "No assistant, no buffer." "I've heard," he said. "I figured," I replied. There was a longer pause than usual. "Can you tell me what happened?" I didn't walk him through everything. "I didn't need to. I think you already know," I said. "No one just said it in a way you were ready to hear." He didn't argue. "They say you left at the worst possible time," he said. "I left when I was no longer allowed to hold the things that were keeping it together," I answered. Another pause. "We didn't think it depended on one person," he said, quieter this time. "It didn't," I said. "It depended on whether those people still trusted each other." A slow exhale, and we lost that. I didn't confirm it. I didn't need to. The call ended without apology, without resolution. But there was one thing we both understood. What they lost wasn't an employee. It was a layer of trust no report had ever measured. Ethan didn't become a tragedy. He became a lesson. Someone smart enough to build a system on paper, but who never learned how it survives in the real world. And that was enough. They said I froze their empire. No, I just walked away from a place where for too long people believed loyalty could be commanded and competence could be replaced with slides.